We are down in our Thompson Pell Research Center's collection storage with some interesting objects for our upcoming installation.
We've got this scarlet coat with black facings and also these awesome buff leather breeches down there too. And I noticed that this uniform looks a lot like the uniform in this portrait. So who is this gentleman in the portrait?
Yeah, so the portrait, the uniform, and some other objects that we can talk about in a little bit are all connected to one individual, a man named Jacob Schieffelin, which is remarkable to kind of bring together a collection from one person. And Jacob Schieffelin is very interesting because he was born in Pennsylvania to German parents, the first of his family born in America, part of that big German emigration to the middle colonies. And after the French and Indian War, his family actually moves to the new British province of Quebec. So they emigrate to another part of this growing British Empire for the opportunities that are there. And he's in Canada when the American Revolution breaks out. He's part of the defense of that colony. He's in Montreal and then moves out all the way as far west as Detroit on the Great Lakes, which is pretty remarkable. You know, it kind of expands what we think about when we think about the scope of the Revolutionary War. And out there, he serves the British administration and the British military. He's a subaltern in a unit called the Detroit Volunteers, a Loyalist corps that is serving alongside the British and their native allies in the Great Lakes area. And with them, he's deployed southward to Fort Sackville, which is in Vincennes, Indiana.
Wow, that's really on the outskirts of the known world at that time, right?
Yeah, it's really out into Indian country. Again, it's at the fringes of, in some ways, the broader kind of revolution that we think about being concentrated on the East Coast, but it's still an area that's hotly contested. There's an incredibly diverse group of people out there. You know, there are American subjects like this, Native Americans that are out there. There are the descendants of French colonial families that are still there. In fact, a lot of the men under his command are of French origin originally, or mixed race origin. And he's commanding these forces against technically not the Continentals, the Americans, but Virginia forces specifically, who have their own claims to that western region. And over the course of those campaigns, Fort Sackville is laid siege to and surrenders to Virginia forces under George Rogers Clark, who's kind of a famous or infamous, depending on where you land, leader of forces in the kind of far western theaters of the American Revolution.
So I noticed you said that he was part of the Detroit Volunteers, but on the portrait there it says Queen's Rangers?
Yeah, exactly. So back up a bit to get to what the meaning of that is. So after the fall of Fort Sackville, he's taken a prisoner by Virginia. Okay. So he makes this trip kind of down the Wabash, up the Ohio, across the state of Virginia, and with a lot of the other captured officers, he's thrown in the common jail in Williamsburg, the capital. He's in the jail for some time period, but with another British officer who is actually the former commandant of the Illinois country, way out on the Mississippi, to show you how far this kind of story goes. They're able to escape Williamsburg. They break out of the jail, they slip through the countryside, they cross Chesapeake Bay, they hide out on the eastern shore, on the other side of the bay, for weeks, lying low, only appearing in public speaking French, so they wouldn't be identified as escaped British officers, something, of course, he gained from this experience out in the upper country. And finally, they're able to find a friendly ship that will take them home to British-held New York City. While he is there, he does get, at least nominally, a commission in the Queen's Rangers, a famous Loyalist corps in the city, although for a couple other reasons we can talk about, he doesn't really actively serve with them, but clearly they kept it in the nameplate of this portrait here.
Cool. Well, I'm holding a set of beautiful jewelry here, and so what does this jewelry have to do with a military use?
Yeah, the connection might not seem obvious at first blush. That set of jewelry is really interesting because when Jacob gets to New York City, he ends up for a while being billeted with a Quaker family. Quakers, of course, famously pacifists, probably not enthused about having a soldier with them, much less somebody who has suffered this incredible ordeal of captivity and escape, but they're charitable. And in their home is their daughter, Hannah Lawrence. And Hannah was a pretty prolific poet. She was a writer. She supported the American cause and the revolution against the British.
Poetry is about the Patriot cause.
Yeah, absolutely. And her books of poetry survive at the New York Public Library to this day. You can go read them. amazingly with that, and also she had written poems that kind of made fun of the pretentious British officers strutting around town and leafleted them outside Trinity Church, which caused quite an uproar, and had she been identified as the culprit would have gotten her into a great deal of trouble. But despite all of this, being around Jacob, evidently something clicked between the two of them, and they fall in love in 1780. And so in 1780, against her parents' wishes, her and Jacob were married in New York City. And that jewelry right there, that set of 3 jewels, on the back of one of them with those 4 large stones there, is engraved Hannah Lawrence Schieffelin, 1780.
Wow.
So likely her wedding jewelry. What's amazing, even more amazing about that, is that these pieces, we can talk about these in just a moment, but the coat and the painting have been in our collection here for decades. That jewelry is part of the Robert Natolo collection that the museum just recently acquired, bringing back these 2 parts of Jacob and Hannah's pretty remarkable story. Because that story doesn't end at their marriage in 1780. He doesn't serve with the Queen's Rangers. He gets permission from General Henry Clinton to go back to Canada in the middle of the Revolutionary War. And Hannah journals about this. Her diary of this is also at the New York Public Library. And she describes this voyage that takes him from New York out around the Canadian Maritimes, down the St. Lawrence River, out the Great Lakes, and ultimately back to Detroit.
Wow.
And along the way, they meet all of the key figures of the war in the upper country, the British officers, Loyalists, Native Americans who are part of these campaigns. And he spends the rest of the war there, and that's really where this uniform comes from. Obviously, the Queen's Rangers famously wore green uniforms. His Detroit volunteers, we don't know exactly their uniform. A lot of them wore civilian clothing, a lot of native dress in some cases, and French styles of clothing when they're actually serving in the field. This suit right here, though, dates really to the very, very last years of the Revolution, a time at which he got a commission as a lieutenant in the British Indian Department.
Okay.
So one of these officers that, of course, liaised between native nations and their warriors and the British military to coordinate operations. There's no regulation specifically for uniforms for the British Indian Department, and all the surviving uniforms from that service are all slightly different. Red being, of course, the predominant color, very clearly indicates a British officer. He's chosen to use black cotton velvet facings, which is a really lovely touch here. Sadly, the cotton velvet is deteriorating faster than the wool, which is much hardier and much sturdier. But it's interesting to note that on his facings, which also have these loops of gilded lace and gilt buttons, plain buttons, and not regimentally marked or anything, is in a style really of kind of the middle of the 1780s, which is why we position this kind of right at the end of the war. There's a fairly good curvature to the front of that coat. The lapels are just sewn down to the body. They're not functional. And the collar is the real kind of key detail in dating this, because British coats of this time period typically had a full falling collar. This collar falls, but it also has this
Starting to stand up.
slight rise, which is of course familiar from later paintings of George Washington and other figures in the later 1780s and 90s. So it's this really transitional style that is popular only for a limited moment in time, right around the end of his service in the American Revolution. Now, the painting that's here, I should say, is a copy, probably done in the 19th century, maybe the early 20th century, but based off of a portrait miniature whose location is currently unidentified. And the portrait miniature was made of Jacob wearing this coat, which is pretty remarkable. We rarely have a surviving garment and a representation of it. The portrait, although it doesn't capture all the nuances of the original garment, is still reflecting this exact coat, and so it's really interesting to see them together in this sense, especially with Hannah's jewelry next to them, which kind of brings together their story, which, I should add also doesn't end at the end of the Revolution in 1783. This couple spend time going back and forth between the upper country, eventually to London a little bit to help settle some Loyalist claims. But by the middle of the 1790s, Hannah and Jacob, remarkably, moved back to New York City. It's amazing to think that the guy wearing this coat, who had actively fought against the creation of the United States, now becomes a citizen of that nation. He takes over the in-laws business. They were apothecaries, runs it jointly with Hannah's brother for a time, and he becomes incredibly successful in this. They begin to develop areas of New York. There's a neighborhood called Manhattanville, way up on Manhattan Island, that he buys up land and begins to develop. He sold Alexander Hamilton, the property that Hamilton built his home, the Grange, on.
Wow.
And the Schieffelins and the Hamiltons were close for much of the rest of their lives. And his business was quite successful. In fact, his company still exists to this day as part of the broader Moet Hennessy Corporation, of all things. And you used to be able to read that he was the first man to import Hennessy cognac to America. So incredibly successful life by the time that he and Hannah die in the 1830s, having lived in this country that he had resisted the creation of during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. It's great to see those, how personal connections can, supersede political involvement, and, and it's also great that we're bringing back objects from Hannah and Jacob together in one collection.
And simply the rarity of these pieces. I mean, there are so few garments from the American Revolution that survive, that having any is remarkable, much less having one that we can identify to the individual who wore it and the story behind them. And we haven't even mentioned the leather breeches that are here.
Yeah, tell me about the breeches a little bit.
These were part of this acquisition of Jacob's clothing, and I know that as you've been working mounting them, you've had a lot of time to spend with them. They look like they almost haven't been worn.
Yeah.
They're incredibly well preserved, in extraordinary condition, and so they allow us this glimpse into the production of what was one of the most common forms of leg wear for men in the 18th century.
Yeah.
We're thrilled to be able to have them and to put them on display with the coat in a way that helps us reconstruct, Jacob and his physical presence in the world. That's what clothing, I think, is so compelling in doing, is showing us, how people were in some ways. And we've had people comment, seeing this uniform before, saying, oh, well, he's so small. And he is a little bit smaller, I think, than you and I, although he's fairly close to your size, I think. Yeah. But also have to remember that he's a young man at the time of the Revolution. He had also been a prisoner of war. He'd been enduring incredible hardships, and just living a very physical life. And so I think that explains in some cases, the condition of the size of his uniform. And also I think, one of the things we always forget about 18th century clothing is that it fits the body in a different way than clothing today. Today in your suit jacket, you have a boxier shape that emphasizes the shoulders. This doesn't. It clings closer to the body. So again, it helps us look at the aesthetics and kind of the physical shape of people in the 18th century in a way we can't, and then connecting that to these incredible stories of the Revolution.
Excellent. Well, Matt, where can people see these objects?
Yeah, so all of these things you can see on display this year in our Revolutionary Anthology as part of our Revolutionary Possibilities. Both Hannah and Jacob faced a lot of possibilities during this time period, where they'll be up this year, and you can see online like we are talking right now.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.